My subject is hospitality, and I'm going to speak a little bit also about a related topic, namely hostility. As was said earlier, I teach at the Anthropology Department of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London University, and we have a program which includes a master's degree in travel, tourism and pilgrimage. And you may be able to see from all the lanterns and the menus and the spices of this picture, which is our leaflet, how important hospitality is in our studies. So I'm going to talk about hospitality and its first cousin, hostility. As one does, last night I looked at the internet, and the last person to speak on this subject, and I do recommend you to look at it, was Noam Chomsky, the founder of modern linguistics, who was talking at Boston College in the United States about this subject, mainly talking about foreign policy, Western foreign policy, which I'm not going to very much, except right at the end there will be a slight allusion to it. But the main subject is hospitality. Rather than give an immediate definition, although there is quite a good one that one of my students gave me a couple of days ago, namely that to invite someone is to ensure their happiness while they're under your roof, Brillat Savarin, 1865. Rather than do that, which I've just done, I thought we would do a kind of a jigsaw, a circular jigsaw, when we think about the features of hospitality and what we needed to think about if we wanted to understand it. So if we look round the circle, we can see we start with spaces, which is a familiar theme this afternoon. The second one, going round, as you can see, refers to an ancient Sanskrit principle of treating the host rather like a god, the divinity of the guest. You may know that this is the strapline of the Government of India's tourism policy today. Hospitality is linked to time and transition in ways that we will see. And if you think about it, that's not very difficult, really, to agree with, because the main events of hospitality that we do in our life accompany birth, marriage, death, and so on. So the theme of transition, familial transition, and other types of transition and time are as important to hospitality as space. Food is clearly the substance, the main substance, that articulates hospitality exchanges. And we will think a little bit about food and what the metaphors that food presents us with. Clearly, etiquette is also central, as is gift exchange. Hosts give their guests food, but guests also bring to the hosts things in a routine kind of way. Also, guests and hosts exchange honor. The next one, collective rhythms, refers a little bit back to what I said before about family rhythms, the rhythms of our life, birth, marriage, and death, and so on. But we can also think of the rhythms of, for example, a city. People go to work in the morning, they come back in the evening. They might go to a cafe in the midday or the evening. They might go to the theatre, and so on. And leisure is an important part of hospitality, clearly. The rhythms of the city, therefore, are things that I think we should pay attention to. And I would end my little jigsaw, which I'm now going to illustrate, with what I think are salient images and some bursts of music. What I would argue is that it always comes back, in a sense, to the home. I don't mean necessarily the family home, although the family home is central. But the city can also be a home, and so can the state. States, countries, are also homes, or not. So the idea of home is pretty central, in my view, to the understanding of hospitality. And now I would like to illustrate these propositions with reference to certain images. These images are just ways of thinking about and exploring these notions. I'm also going to have full bursts of music. And just to prefigure that, the first one lasts about 25 seconds, and the two next ones last 15 seconds, and the fourth one is a very lively video. So, let's start with spaces of hospitality. And here we have a map of the greatest traveller in the medieval world, in the medieval Islamic world, Ibn Battuta, who was born in Tangier in the early 14th century, and travelled not for a weekend, not for a week, not for a 2-week holiday, but for 30 years, more or less non-stop, over a very large part of the world. And when he came back, he recorded his memoirs to a helpful friend, and he talked about the beauty of the buildings and the beauty of the mosques and the fine intellectuals that he met and the wives that he married. There were several. None of which would have been possible without a shared system of hospitality throughout this part of the world. He spoke, I think, Arabic and Persian. He didn't speak Swahili, for example, although he went to West Africa. And he didn't speak East Africa and West Africa as well as China and as well as right up to the north. But if he didn't speak all the languages, he certainly knew, and the people he met knew, what he expected as a guest. And he knew what he expected of his hosts. And he knew, for example, how to get a job. Clearly, he needed resourcing throughout his travels, and he was very resourceful in finding himself work when he needed it. He spent 10 years or thereabouts as a judge in Delhi, for example. Being in Delhi, he might have been aware of this Sanskrit principle, Atithi Devo Bhava, basically the guest as God. And as I said, the Indian Tourist Board and the Indian government have adopted this principle as one that represents the hospitality of India. The Divinity of the Guest is also a title of a wonderful article written in 1925 by one of the most important anthropologists of the early part of the 20th century, A.M. Hocart. And from Hocart's article, I think the anthropology of hospitality took off. So the Divinity of the Guest is a landmark in anthropology, as it is in our understanding of hospitality. The next piece of the jigsaw, you may remember, had to do with time and transition. And here I'm using a famous story in Genesis of the visit to Abraham by the three angels. Or were they three men? Or were they, in fact, one God? And the Hebrew text is purposefully ambiguous and ambivalent about these things. But anyway, the angels came around the corner, unexpected. Abraham was sitting by his tent, minding his own business. And then when he saw them, he came to them and said, "Look, I would like to give you hospitality." So he says to his wife, Sarah, "Go and fetch a calf, nice one. You cook it, and we'll serve it to the three visitors." The three strangers. He'd never met them before. He didn't know where they had come from or why they were there. But he served them the calf, and he washed their feet, and he directed them towards a tree where they could hide from the sun. And they were very pleased by this, obviously, as one would, and they immediately became his friends, which illustrates, possibly, the main core of hospitality, which is to convert a stranger into a friend. So this is an Orthodox painting by Rublev, as you see, and this is another one by Rembrandt, and a third one by Chagall. And all of these ones have transition and time very much incorporated into them. It was a time in the world when a plurality of divinities was giving slowly way to ideas of a single God. But in Abraham's own family, the transitional point can be illustrated by the fact that one of the angels, one of the men, or was it God, said to him that his wife was going to have a child. And Abraham and Sarah didn't believe this, since they were both quite elderly. And then God said, well, everything is possible. And it's not for you to not believe or even to laugh at what I'm saying, because I can do what I want. The story of Abraham and the calf and so on directs us to the centrality of food. And this wonderful painting, or this detail actually, of a painting by Bellini is very appropriate in my view. Clearly, the guests at this meeting are enjoying themselves. They're not exactly smiling or laughing, but they're clearly enjoying themselves, as one can see from some of the actions of some of the participants there. And another thing that is interesting is that the Ming vase that is carried by the lady who is doing some of the serving comes from China. And this vase was given by the Chinese authorities to the Mamluk authorities in Egypt, and they gave it to the Doge of Venice, and it was in Venice, or from Venice, that Bellini saw the vase and incorporated it into this picture. The next two are also about food, different types of food possibly. This is by a photographer, Martin Parr, who I have a great deal of respect for. The Last Resort, quite a famous photograph of a British canteen, cafe, and you might reflect on the extent to which this scene tells us about hospitality in the contemporary world or not. And here we see more food, this time in a cruise ship, which is quite relevant today. A buffet, and one can imagine the delights of sampling this range of food. And etiquette. And here is some music, which provides a considerable flavour for the relationship between Louis XIV and the Duke. If you look at this painting, you can see the relationship between the king and the duke, very powerful actually. Somebody who could have threatened Louis. But this picture of hospitality taking place in the court, these wonderful steps which are not there anymore, speaks of power and speaks of the relationship between one host who's very powerful and a guest who could be powerful. But the hospitality itself is, in a way, mediating the relationship between them. All the army people there, the priests are up there, members of the court, and so on. A very fine picture, in my view, which illustrates the etiquette of hospitality. And thanks to Les Arts Florissants and William Christie for providing that illustration. I'm fond of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, partly because I'm involved in a project in Ethiopia which has to do with tourism as sustainable development in that country. And the Queen of Sheba comes from Ethiopia. People in Ethiopia think. Some people think she comes from Yemen. But anyway, she comes to meet King Solomon, and her handmaidens are clearly bringing gifts with them. So I think this picture, this fine picture by the photographer Steve Rossetti, illustrates the feature of hospitality, which has to do with the exchange of gifts. And this one, again, about the Queen of Sheba. This you must know, because it's one of the most famous pieces of music in the classical repertoire by Handel. And there is King Solomon, there is the Queen of Sheba, and all her handmaidens bringing all sorts of good stuff. And this speaks of the honour of the host, the honour that the Queen gives to the host, and the host gives to the Queen. Collective rhythms I did refer to earlier on, and I just made the proposition that collective rhythms can be found in all sorts of places, including the city, as well as in families and communities. And I couldn't resist this one, which gives a beautiful idea, I think, of the rhythm of a cafe in Paris. Maybe I enjoy cafes in Paris, which is why I took it. But amazingly, despite what the notice says, the music that you hear is by one instrument only, one accordion. And the final musical episode we have is something rather different, which we can make as loud as we like. An Algerian marriage ceremony in Paris. One sees the married couple, or the about to be married couple, up at the top. One sees the empty crib, and and the family is all around. So the theme of collective rhythms, if you like, is, in my view, pretty important when we're understanding hospitality. And we come back, finally, to home. And I would make the point again that home is not only the family home, but home can be the city, it can be a state, as I'm going to refer to in a second. But I thought that Murillo's expulsion of the prodigal son, his painting of the return of the prodigal son, which is a quite moving picture of the hospitality given by a family to an errant person, and the villagers in Tasso's version, is a good memory of a good reminder of the hospitality that a family can provide. In the final two, so that's the jigsaw, which we've already done, and we can see it there. I now finally want to end the talk with a reference to the first cousin of hospitality, namely hostility. And I refer you back to the lecture that I spoke about by Noam Chomsky. In my view, if we were to do a jigsaw of this, we would start with a stranger, we would talk about internment, we would talk about refugees, we would talk about separation, and so on. And to illustrate these points, this is a very famous picture by Edward Hopper, the Western Motel. We don't know who she is, where she is going, where she's come from. We don't know her name. She is completely removed and remote. This is a picture of the wall around Bethlehem, or in Bethlehem actually, which is a fine, it's a powerful symbol, if you like, of fractured hospitality, and the idea that hostility, arms, watchtowers, walls are the only ways to provide security. Here is an internment camp, a drawing of an internment camp in Australia, and this is a picture of a boat listing in the sea, also relevant today. I just would like to say that these two artists have received numerous prizes in Australia for their work, and it does remind us that artists, musicians, teachers, intellectuals of various kinds sometimes find themselves in the firing line, so to speak, or at the cutting edge of thinking about open doors, lack of boundaries, and the regimes of hospitality that go with them. Finally, I would like to end on an optimistic note, because one might think that the contemporary world, after Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on, is bound to move in the direction of hostility more than hospitality. But especially in a place like the Mediterranean, which is often regarded by the media as being some kind of a place where Muslims, Jews, and Christians are in permanent conflict. And I would like to return, in a sense, to my favorite town in the world, namely Marseille, where they have, in my view, succeeded in providing the kind of spaces for hospitality, for people to move from the south of the Mediterranean and way beyond it, from China and so on, into the city and enjoy a good relationship with one another. And this final picture is a photograph taken by Abdelmajid Arif, a friend of mine in the University of Aix-Marseille. And this is of dresses that are bought by Algerian and Moroccan families for their daughters, woven by tailors from the North African coast, in a market in Marseille which is owned by a Jewish person. And I think that is quite a good place to leave the subject in a way, because I think if one thinks in those kind of ways, one can see a way in which cities, families, states, and other institutions can actually address and, in a sense, conquer hostility by precisely hospitality. Thank you.